This is an assessment support video for Entrepreneurship in Sport Assessment 2. The assessment will be an individual piece of work with 50% of the module mark. The word limit is 1500 words, but I will accept 10% addition up to 1650. The principal focus of the assessment will be about a reflexive look, a forward look or a predictive look into the future of the UK sports industry in the 21st century. So I'd like you to consider what will happen in the next 50 years or so, and the role of the entrepreneur within that change or lack of change. And principally I'd like you to consider the difference between what is entrepreneurship and enterprise, the difference between the multiple sectors that run sport, so that of the private sector entrepreneur versus the social entrepreneur, and whether organisations will dominate, i.e. the entrepreneurial focus within firms or the entrepreneur working within an enterprising firm, or whether individuals will dominate, the classical view of the private sector or not-for-profit sector, individual entrepreneur, new business startups. So there's a whole host of areas and ideas to consider. I'll ask you to define those in principle in part of the essay, but to construct an argument of what you think the future will look like and which sector or type of entrepreneur will have the biggest influence moving forward. So bear in mind the broad view of what entrepreneurship is, and that it's not necessarily the stereotypical view of enterprise being a capitalist private sector. That wasn't necessarily the original intention of scholars such as Schumpeter. They saw the entrepreneur as somebody recognising opportunities or problems and being proactive in solving those opportunities or problems. And I need you to be clear about what that definition is, and also to put that into context. One, that sports industry is very different to other industries in how it's run, and within that broad sport umbrella we have a variety of different organisations and individuals doing a variety of different things under the kind of broad umbrella of sport, i.e. the for-profit, social sector, not-for-profit sector, public sector. And the fact that we have elite sport organisations and participation sport organisations. So the basic structure will be an overall introduction. Within that introduction I'll expect you to outline the sort of principal areas that you'll be focusing on, certainly around the discussion of what type of entrepreneurs you think may dominate moving forward. And outside the introduction, which should only be a maximum of 100 words, I'd like you to consider a succinct definitions of the different types of entrepreneurs and how they apply to sport, no more than 650 words. And then the key discussion area, section 3, will have a argumentative focus. So I'd like you to put forward your ideas and make sure that you support those ideas with relevant citations, up-to-date information. So don't base your judgment on what the next 50 years will look like from market intelligence or information or trends that were based in the 1980s, 1990s, because they may not be relevant now in 2015, never mind in 2065. So create an argument, and I want you to consider how your argument, how your reflexive view may impact sport. So if your argument is that social entrepreneurs will dominate, I want you to consider what impacts that might have on the overall sporting infrastructure. And again, these are predictions. I may not agree with your predictions, but as long as they're well justified and the evidence is cited, you will be rewarded the marks. Consider how much weighting is going on these sections. The introduction is only worth 5%. The definitions and the clear discussion area of how you think the sport industry is going to look like carry the most weight. The conclusion section should just be reaffirming your clear points. Deadline is May the 8th, which is Friday, and it will all be on Turnitin, no paper copies, and Turnitin will be open until 11:59 in the evening. In constructing your arguments, I'd like you to kind of go back to basics on what we've defined as the sports industry, sports market this year. So it's a combination of the idea of presented by Grattan and Taylor about mass participation market versus elite sports. So this isn't the sports development pyramid as you may have learned it in sports development. This is an economic view of sport, showing the size of the market and the nature of the market. So Grattan and Taylor talked about sports participation, organisation services, products. They also talked about elite sport services and products, and we've focused on all year the business models and how these organisations or individuals working in these areas may well differ. Inevitably, if we apply the sports development principles, they're linked because the mass participation sports market serves the players to elite sport. But elite sport, their income isn't generated with the players in mind, their income is generated with the fan in mind. And they may have different influences. Andreev talks about the disconnection between these in terms of economic, finance, business practice terms, in that they're very distinct sectors with distinct services and they're very different. High-level sport is very much about providing the event, providing the entertainment, whereas mass participation sport is about providing the service, and the customer is not the fan but the participant themselves, so that's where the income generation comes from. We also have high because those previous models don't necessarily represent the complexity of the types of organisations or individuals working to deliver services and products in that mass participation or elite sport industry. So sport, being a unique environment with its own wicked problems, has an interplay and organisation infrastructure that will be public, not-for-profit and private sector led. And this is very dynamic. It isn't certainly equal, but it's also growing and changing at different rates in the different sectors. And we've combined those models into a very simple quadrant-based model, which identifies 4 broad areas. So we've got public sector versus private sector, the not-for-profits operate in the middle ground, versus Grattan and Taylor's participation sector and elite sports sector. And we've positioned different types of organisations in each of these quadrants. But the influence on where the finance is coming from, but also the values within this spectrum. So are we more mission, social focused in these centre grounds, whereas we're more income focused, market focused, consumer focused in the private sector grounds. So we see organisations delivering activities for profit but still meeting the overall agenda, getting people fit and active. Whereas in these sorts of quadrants, especially down right here, we may well have schools and those environments only providing the sport for all. What I need you to consider is how this model may develop. Will this be an equal share? Is it an equal share in terms of how sport is run at the moment? Will we see one quadrant in the participation sport or elite sports start to dominate? Will we see the reduction in public sector funding moving forward? Will we see more of a community, consumer focused rather than a mission focused development of sport, i.e. will we listen to customers and what they want versus what the IOC wants? So thinking about that, you need to define how sport and the sports industry may work. Consider the Council of Europe's definition, and that it's fairly broad in that from physical fitness to casual or organised sport. And whereas you might not define fitness activities as being sport, as competitive traditional sports, does the fitness industry and the growth of the fitness industry have any impact on traditional sport and how it's managed, both physical activity and elite? I.e., if we open 1,000 more low-cost gyms in the next 50 years, will that see the death of the traditional sports centre, sports or 25 metre pool if they can no longer sustain themselves, compounded by the fact that public investment may reduce. Or the public investment may increase as a result of that to protect those services. I'd like you to consider what the arguments are for and against. What you mustn't get caught in the trap of doing is postulating an argument without actually supporting that. So if you feel that the government should do that, but actually at the moment they're not doing that, then you need to consider that your own personal view of what should happen isn't clouded by what the trends are showing you. So I want you to be objective as you can in making your assessment about where the future's going. So in terms of defining entrepreneurship, I want you to think about what the broad definition of entrepreneurship is, without getting trapped into viewing entrepreneurship as purely private sector. So let's distinguish with a broad definition of what entrepreneurship is, but then distinguish between what entrepreneurship in a public, not-for-profit and private sector might be, so the differences between for-profit entrepreneurship versus social entrepreneurship to start with. So the difference between income as the lead mission versus being whether values or tradition, that mission-orientated focus might be something very different to for-profit maximisation in the social entrepreneur world. I also need to talk about that of the traditional startup entrepreneur, which we stereotypically think of, versus enterprise or entrepreneurship in organisations, so the idea of intrapreneurship. That gives us a framework of lots of different types of entrepreneurs. For example, public sector is dominated by organisations, so what we have there is a public sector social entrepreneur focus within organisations. So they're a social entrepreneur versus a individual public sector entrepreneur starting up their own activity. That would probably more likely fit with the not-for-profits. And in the not-for-profit areas, what you have is corporate organisations as well as individuals operating. So you can have a social entrepreneur that's starting out their own company, organisation, not-for-profit, versus a social entrepreneur working within a leisure trust or a national governing body of sport or a higher education institution which operates on that middle ground. You also need to then consider the private sector environment where you can have the classical view of the entrepreneur startup for profit. So in considering your definitions for enterprise, I want you to think about the research available to you. So in terms of entrepreneurial orientation, an area that we looked at during the module, the key research literature is fairly consistent in traditional private sector world that the entrepreneurial orientation of an organisation has a direct impact on its success in terms of longevity and into survival and ongoing expansion. So the higher the entrepreneurial orientation, the more successful they're likely to be. We've seen some evidence of that in the not-for-profit and in the public sector. So the justification for focus on enterprise is certainly being developed within the literature, and entrepreneurial orientation has been split up by various authors. Lumpkin et al., for example, they're looking at dimensions including how innovative the organisations and people are, what their risk-taking tolerance is, both as organisation and as individuals, how proactive are they, so how they scan and how they creating new ideas, how aware are they of the competition and how aggressive are they with it, and the autonomy of the organisers or the managers within the organisations to pursue these ideas, or are they quite strict and narrow focused. So you need to consider in constructing your evidence what the key drivers for the various sectors are and how can entrepreneurs within those sectors display these, or organisations display these characteristics. And if your assumption is that public sector isn't very innovative, doesn't take risks, isn't very proactive, you've got to consider if you think the public sector is going to dominate long term, what do they need to do potentially to make this change? And if they don't make this change in the private sector, are being innovative, are taking risks, are being proactive, and that we're seeing the influence of the private sector encroach on public sector provision, you need to be confident in your argument of justifying how public sector will continue to develop. So again, being objective about whether you feel that something should happen versus what the information and the evidence is showing currently is happening. That's not to say that what's happening in 2015 or the last few years will continue to happen, but if you are arguing for a certain case, you need to justify what the changes might need to look like for those sectors to continue to dominate. So I want you to think about those sectors, the sports, the values that are within there, and whether they might need to change or they will change. So for the institutional values of sport, from the IOC down to governing bodies, down to how public sector, will those traditional values that we've built the sporting infrastructure on remain, or will we see those be eroded by the individual entrepreneur that's not confined by those institutional values, that to work in the umbrella of sport can do what they want? They have to conform to legal structures, but they don't necessarily have to conform to the 26 sports in the Olympic structure. There isn't a requirement to do that. Public sector made a choice to invest in that and to keep focusing on that in the UK, but the private entrepreneur doesn't necessarily have to do that, and we're seeing the evolution of some activities as an example of that. For example, the tricking and parkour developments and tough mudder style competitions, arguably in the European Council definition, would fall under sport physical activity, but are not necessarily restricting themselves to the rules of the game. They're not restricting themselves to providing activities that will service the Olympic Games or the Commonwealth Games. The professional sport, they're almost mashing up and coming up with new concepts, still delivering physical activities, because they're not confined by those deep-rooted institutional values of the IOC or traditional sport. So think about what Dolan et al. Suggests as 3 categories of values. The individual entrepreneur might be able to focus on what they want to do and their set of beliefs, versus the institution or societies. The economic values and ethics of what people want to do. The emotional or emotive values of what people want to do. What we do know is that institutional values can influence sport, and we're seeing more and more evidence of how people will organise the structures of their organisations and the functions of their organisations around deep-rooted values, whether that be from an individual or the adoption of the broad set of institutional values like the IOC values. We are also seeing value conflict in change environments, where public sector finance is disappearing for some governing bodies of sport, as an example, and the traditional roots of the values of the sport are being eroded because of the survivalist mentality that's needed. So we're seeing some sports, smaller governing bodies that lack access to finances beyond public sector, having to rethink their delivery and their services, which is divided in opinion within those organisations. Are they there to provide sports in sports clubs, or they're there to survive as an organisation financially in terms of maintaining their management structures and their staffing structures? To do that, they might need to have more commercial products and services. So the key things to think about in constructing and crafting your argument: do the politics of the next 5, 10, 15 years differ from the last 10, 15 years? Will we see a shift? Some of the examples at the moment is use contemporary, look at the manifestos they've been proposing for the election. Most of the parties are shifting their rhetoric and language away from elite sport and towards physical activity. that is a commitment for at least the next 5 years towards a different agenda than we've had for the last 10, 15 years, which has been very much up to 2012 elite sport focus. But that language has changed. Will it continue to change? Will we see a yo-yo in effect in the UK? Will the coalitions have an impact? Some of the mega trends that sport can't control, such as technology developments. Sport couldn't control the multi-platform environments that you now see. The technology that's coming in, it can request influence, but doesn't necessarily control anything. So it has to react to those trends and what people do with the technology, the access, Web 2.0, Web 3.0. Will that have a massive effect? So will we see more sharing of new ideas, the younger generations having a diverse range of interests because they've got access to different ideas through different platforms compared to your generation that had a more restricted range of interests? And my generation, or beyond, that had an even narrower range of interests because the platforms were quite restricted. What about the population influences within the UK, which is the focus of the essay? Will we have an hourglass population pyramid where we're seeing very much services focused on older age groups and new services focused on younger age groups? Are there opportunities where we're seeing the new baby booms come through, kind of Generation Y, Generation Z having an influence on what type of activities we start developing? We also need to consider where the static nature of sports participation for the last 10, 15 years will go up or down with the current set of provision, or will we need to think differently? And who is going to deliver that? Will the public sector have to do it, or will the private sector be the only ones that can do it? Will the not-for-profits be squeezed in the middle? So in considering that, you can construct your argument around whether you see all three sectors having an equal contribution, for example, and what sport might look like. You may feel that the not-for-profits will have to increase. The private sector might get to saturation point and the public sector will shrink. You may argue for the fact that the public sector should be driving it again, but you need to explain what has to happen for that to be the case and be objective about whether the current mission-led focus can deliver that or whether that mindset needs to change. Well, again, these two sectors remain constant. You may argue that the public sector are in retreat or will not recover and will be targeted. The not-for-profits will maintain themselves and we'll see a mass increase in private sector organisationals as well as micro-entrepreneurs. Whatever you do, I want you to support it. Use the information available to you. We already know that public sector investment is some of the lowest in Europe. We know that even though other countries like Germany are investing, it's only in participation, they don't invest in elite. Will we see this figure come down further? We already know that some of the facility infrastructure developments, the major developments, have been run by private sector and not-for-profits, not by public. So in crafting your arguments, there's evidence available to you. So it's not just an opinion-led piece, it's an opinion-led piece informed by relevant research. So in considering the implications, we know that we've got an aging facility infrastructure, we know we need new generation facilities. But if your argument is that the public or not-for-profit sector, the social entrepreneur, the mission-led entrepreneur will be the ones driving that, whether that be through organisations, so the social entrepreneur or the social entrepreneur, people who develop their own socially focused organisations, they may well replace these old generation facilities with like. They've bought into the tradition and the values and feel that that's what the folks should be moving forward, versus the private sector consumer focused entrepreneur that's not bought into the traditional sport values and isn't necessarily confined by the rules of those sports and the structure of the sports, and is far freer to be innovative and creative, whilst also meeting the needs of the consumer. So we may see swimming developed in a completely different way if it's left in the hands of the private micro-entrepreneur or the private sector intrapreneur, those entrepreneurs working within organisations like the Gym Group or Virgin Group, not confining themselves to traditional mindsets and values in sports. Whichever happens, I'd like you to think about how our infrastructures and our ecosystems of sports may change. You've only got maximum 1,650 words, so I'd like you to think about some really key lines of argument rather than try to tackle everything. So I'd like you to be clear about which type of entrepreneur you think may dominate, why they might dominate, what are the key current trends that indicate that, and then think about what the impacts might be.